Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on how to create an empowered culture that drives productivity. I'm Julia King, a business and technology journalist, and I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. And now about today's topic. Where and how we work is changing rapidly. Remote and hybrid work, for example, are here to stay. And as a result, the role of leaders, managers, employees, they're all shifting. How workers engage with their organization is also shifting. Today's webinar is all about how to establish a new employee experience and culture that drives productivity, while at the same time promotes employee empowerment, wellness, and trust. We'll be talking about factors that impact culture, as well as how to create a culture focused on healthy productivity. We'll also explore how data can improve employee experience and support emerging cultures while simultaneously driving productivity in the new world of work. Our presenters today are Michael Schrage, who is a visiting scholar with MIT's Sloan Initiative on the Digital Economy. Michael also serves as an advisor on innovation issues and investments to major firms and presents workshops worldwide on design experimentation and innovation with work. Josh Klein is CEO of Indigo Metrics, a platform using data analytics to measure and manage purpose and behavior within organizations, or what Josh calls the new P&L of culture. He is a hacker who started breaking into computer systems and networks in middle school and ended up consulting on this topic and with executives and government leaders. Along the way, he's written several books and many articles, has hosted television series about innovation, and addressed audiences at TED and Davos. Gabriela Mauck is Vice President at ActiveTrack's Productivity Lab, a dedicated team focused on helping organizations transition to a productivity-oriented mindset. Gabriela joined ActiveTrack following a career focused on organizational effectiveness, leadership, and design at management consulting firms. She shifted to the corporate world, out of the consulting world, as a means of bringing organizational strategy and solutions to life. Gabriela, I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Julia. I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to go through our agenda today and introduce a poll before we get to our presentation. So when we think about what we're going over today, we're going to start with a presentation from Josh, who will guide us in explaining the transformation of culture over in the recent years. From there, we'll lead ourselves into a discussion. And so we'll have a discussion following Josh's presentation about how the impact of culture's most recent transformation impacts the data that we look at, the insights that we collect, and then, of course, the way in which we manage the culture that we're dealing with today. So what I want to do is I want to start us with a poll. And so if we go to the next slide here, we will introduce this poll. And so the question to the group is about the pandemic. And so I'm curious to understand sort of what impact the pandemic had on your culture. Did it strengthen your culture, weaken your culture, challenge your culture? Did it force you to revisit the fundamental values, or did it have a limited impact on your organization? So we'll give this a few minutes, and as we do that, I'd welcome Josh or Michael, any sort of suspicions you might have, or your curiosity around this question as our audience partakes.
This is Michael. I'm actually very curious what the distribution is going to be. I think depending upon what the distribution is, it may influence some of the comments I have and questions I ask.
Great. Well, we'll give it a few more minutes.
Moments, not minutes.
Yeah, a few more moments.
Wow.
Interesting.
Wow.
What are you most surprised by, Josh, in that interesting response?
Just that, I mean, challenged, yes, but what is the inference of challenge? That challenge was met? For example, not many people said that it strengthened the culture. Similarly, not many people said it didn't have an impact. So yeah, I'm just curious, what exactly does challenge point to?
Well, that's what we'd like to address. Can we go back to the poll for a moment?
Yeah.
There we go. I do think it's an interesting tail phenomenon. You know, what does not destroy you make for some organizations clearly stronger, limited, obviously robust or resilient culture. Most people consider it a challenge. I'm intrigued that over a quarter it forced them to revisit fundamental values. And Josh, I think that's going to feed into some of your comments on this, because what are the values that people need to keep track of? And it's intriguing that, you know, 10%, it weakened, it hurt the culture in that regard. So it didn't necessarily leave them better off. So I'm going to be very, very curious for the comments that we're going to get in chat. And I'm going to be very, very curious, Josh, how this resonates with your message.
Yeah, absolutely.
My reaction to this one is that forced us to revisit fundamental values certainly isn't mutually exclusive to the first three here, right? You know, your reaction can be that it strengthened your culture, you know, once you went back and revisited those fundamental values. Additionally, oftentimes a very challenging exercise for your organization to step back and think, you know, who are we? What are we doing? What do we believe in? Whether we're in the office, out of the office, a combination of the two. So I think that forced us to revisit the fundamental values one really could coincide with one of the first three here as well. So it tees us up for a nice conversation. If we close this poll out and we move into sort of, Josh, your overview of the culture transformation, we'll hand it off to you.
All right. So I wanted to frame up the question or the conversation with a few posits, and we can debate this as we go. But I wanted to start with the idea that the way that human capital management has evolved over time hasn't been as dramatic until the last few years, and particularly with technology, and then especially with the rise of the pandemic, there have been some real radical changes. So you have a bunch of effects stacking on top of each other, starting with tech, coming into the effects of the pandemic, and now leaving us where we are today, where there's, you know, a very tight labor market. There are very new imperatives that employees are using to drive their decisions about where they want to work. There's new imperatives on organizations around structure. It's a lot that has changed. So I'm going to throw some of the ideas that we use in my own company out there, and I'm curious to get feedback as we go along to see if you buy it, some of the things that I'm going to suggest here. But to start with, just at a really high level, I wanted to begin by suggesting that the way that companies have evolved to exert influence or cultural influence, essentially the way that they have gone about changing and aligning the behaviors of their employee base, began with face-to-face, and that's where a lot of the original hierarchies came out. You know, you have your senior executives who communicate their messaging to their direct reports. Their direct reports then communicate to their direct reports, and et cetera, all the way down, which, while suffering from the problems of the game of telephone, worked to a degree and up to a certain scale. The difference is that now we have digital tools which allow you to do this at much greater scale, and also to pass on indirect messaging. Now, this is both good and bad, right? On the one hand, you have the advantages of scale. On the other hand, you have problems where if someone indirectly passes the wrong message, it can be distributed much more broadly. And then, of course, you look at what scale really means these days, which is all of the above except exponentially applied. So again, trying to get us to think in terms of network effects and some of the impacts that technology have had more broadly within the organizational structure. So if you take that all as writ, you then have what is a very different operating environment, right? Like we've got, for example, the distributed workforce or the impact of the pandemic, which even if your workforce is not fully distributed, they're now operating in a different environment in which utilization of online tools, the impact of social software, different kinds of cultural messaging it's suddenly a very different environment. And it's interesting to see how companies are responding to this in terms of bringing people back to the office or not bringing people back to the office, the role of this in hiring, and then more particularly, the role of this in how organizations see the importance of culture. Because one of my favorite lines is that conduct risk, every employee is now only pixels away from conduct risk. And that's because in a distributed workforce kind of environment, you've got a whole lot more autonomy, but you've also got a whole lot more exposure to very different social pressures. One of the things that I feel like has been very understudied is the impact of social software on workforces. Because in an open plan office, if you were voraciously participating in your Facebook group around whether or not the Earth is flat, people would probably look askance at that. Whereas now you can have as many other windows open as you like, right? And essentially what I posit is that as we start looking at the impact of cultural values on behaviors, on workplace efficiency, one of the things that's been under or maybe perhaps discounted is the impact of the larger social sphere that everyone is participating in, whether they're in a distributed workforce or not. And one of the other big impacts is concomitant to that purpose has now become much more important than ever before. The idea that financial incentives alone are enough to drive your employee is largely a thing of the past. Obviously, it's an important component, but I think we've all seen plenty of evidence that the workforce of today has other things that are driving them and that are equally important. And one of the big posits that I'd be curious to get feedback from the other panelists on is the posit that you can model and manage that. Again, my belief is that we have access to a lot of different data sources so that we can in fact begin to gather information around the behaviors and the beliefs, the values of employees, and seek alignment around them. And that now that is more important than it has ever been.
Josh, I'd like to ask you a quick question based on that. With the organizations that you work with, have you observed that they have a culture and they want to slap a purpose atop that culture, or that rethinking purpose is forcing them to revisit the way their culture lives and serves that purpose? What's been your experience, and what have the diagnostics revealed to you and your colleagues?
All of the above. So, and it's a very interesting question, because most of the time at the senior levels, at least, there's a pretty strong idea of purpose. But what's interesting is that very often that's not something that anyone out of the C-suite has any thoughts of, any understanding of in any real tangible way. And so one of the big challenges that I'm seeing leaders have to grapple with a lot these days is, A, if you have a sense of your purpose or not, how do you articulate that? And then B, does that resonate with your employees? And if it does, how do you improve that alignment? How do you actualize this? How do you make that a driver for behavior? Or if not, how do you create it in such a way or pivot it in such a way that it does? And it's a major challenge.
Quick last intervention on that, without inappropriately revealing things. When you do your diagnostics, what percentage of organizations have that degree of decoupling between an executive suite understanding of purpose and the workforce understanding / acceptance of purpose? Is it almost 80% aligned? 50%? What's the split?
So understanding or belief in are highly different. I would say that maybe, well, a little less than half, I would say, have an employee base that understand the purpose, like nominally have a good idea of what the purpose is in a believable way, as in, oh yeah, this is our purpose. But in terms of this is our purpose and I know what that means for my job, that's like 20%.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah, so it on the other hand, the number of our customers or potential customers even who believe that purpose is increasingly critical is nearly universal. So it's an interesting situation in that something which was previously primarily used for marketing purposes has suddenly become mission critical, not just for talent retention, but for orienting employees. Because again, with a newly autonomous, in many cases, much more newly autonomous workforce, you need that sense of purpose to drive, functional work within the organization. So, and then to mitigate risk.
Is that, and Josh, a question for you on that. Do you find that the responsibility of defining that purpose really sits at the top just with leadership, or are we now seeing a evolution in which the employees themselves are playing a role in defining that purpose?
It's an interesting question because the two go hand in hand. The more that leadership believes that this is something that employees should have a role in, the more effective they are, and usually the better an idea they have of what their purpose actually is. In other words, it's an iterative process. It's not I'm the CEO, so I know, and if you don't like it, then lump it. It's, oh, this is what our purpose is that most of us already know. I need to more tightly couple this into my employees' day-to-day, work. So I'm going to go ahead and jump ahead a little bit. So one of the problems around this is that most companies aren't designed for this. And again, I recognize I'm casting aspersions here, but again, just based on my experience, let me make some crude analogies here. One of the things that we've seen with a lot of large organizations is that they effectively have a really large management layer at the top, because again, if your way of transmitting or influencing behavior through your organization is by telling someone and having them tell someone who tells someone, you need a lot of people so that you can do that more effectively. Now, when I say more effectively, it needs to be kept in mind that that's actually not very effective compared to other means, I would argue. It's relatively cumbersome. It's also expensive because you need people who are strongly motivated and strongly aligned, which means, again, a larger management layer. It's subject to bias signaling, and it's not very agile because it takes time to propagate those messages and make sure that everyone's repeating the same thing. The other downside to this is that you then have a large disengaged employee base. And one of the things that we talk a lot about inside my company is that very often we come across what we call the parent-child model, which is the leadership at the top are the bosses, they're the parents, and everyone else is considered to be the child. So one of the things we've seen with a lot of companies that have used engagement software or more traditional engagement software for a long time is employees can complain into the ether, they're expected to do so, and then someone eventually maybe responds in some way that might respond to their problem, but they shouldn't worry their pretty little heads about it in the meantime. And the problem here is that obviously this makes it very hard for that employee base to connect their identity to the organizational purpose. So again, it leads to a decoupling. And then contractors are not involved at all. They're not expected to be engaged with this. So if you take that as a counterpoint, or if you take a counterpoint to that, visualizing what the digital organization might look like, there's a much smaller leadership core up at the top where they're gathering data, they're looking to see what's resonating, they're understanding what messaging is aligning, again, that concept of individual identity to organizational purpose. But then throughout all the other layers of the organization are influencers. There are people who are strongly aligned with those values, who strongly evince the behaviors that give rise to those values, and they're then disseminating those cultural mores and the concomitant behaviors throughout the rest of the organization. That then leads to a more engaged employee base who are, have critical skills and also are strongly aligned with that mission or with that purpose. And then you have culturally aligned contractors who may come in or out of the organization. And as they do so, they remain strongly aligned to what those values are, and that makes them both more effective and more valuable, because when they go out, they presumably gather more information and more skills that make them more useful and are more inclined to come back in. So I recognize that is slightly Pollyannic, but in terms of a simplification, it can give you an idea of some of what we're seeing as emergent behaviors in more successful organizations around this type of thing. One of the other problems is that a lot of the existing tools are not enormously effective in this new environment. And part of that is, as I've said before, a lot of, especially the older engagement softwares that are out there, is that there isn't an expectation that employees are supposed to benefit directly. So when I let my engagement platform know that I'm not happy, it's not at all clear how that's messaging up to leadership to affect the mission of the organization.
Let me ask a quick, mean question in that regard. Should we simply just eliminate engagement checks and pulses? Are the harms rivaling the benefits in this regard? Have you seen organizations effectively decouple or transition away from the engagement survey?
Yes and no. I've seen companies reduce their use of engagement surveys, but not completely get rid of them. And that's because there is utility there, right? Like if you want qualitative information, that's a good way to do it. But where I've seen it done successfully is where it's very clearly, hey, we know that the finance department is having a problem in this area. Could you please tell us more about it so we can do X, right? It's taking the problem that the employees have and directly correlating that to an action to solve that problem. It's not, aisle 5, please report on whether you're happy or not, because it turns out that's not very meaningful.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
A couple thoughts on that question. I'll take a stab at it as well, Michael. I mean, this idea around potentially eliminating the engagement survey, which I recognize was intentionally provocative. I think that there are values to the engagement survey in that if that is the only mechanism your organization has to collect employee feedback, then it's an important one to keep. Hopefully what today's conversation continues to evolve into as we go, we finalize Josh's presentation, we have a discussion, is that there are additional mechanisms that provide the ability to have more ongoing, real-time, less biased insights. And so, well, if the option is nothing or the engagement survey, well, then the engagement survey looks like a really beneficial and valuable add for your organization. But hopefully today what we discuss is the fact that there are other options, and those other options have the ability to give you what we believe to be significantly less biased ongoing insights.
I fully agree. I think the point that I'm trying to make, and yes, I'm making it with our audience in mind, is to what extent are the people listening to this going to have to recognize that they may need to transition away from a false and not particularly helpful over-reliance on engagement as a proxy for alignment, purpose, and all the other issues that you and Josh have raised here. I'll stop there.
It's a fair point. So just to finish up on this slide, again, I'm not trying to malign engagement software or any other, HCM software that's out there, but rather to point out that particularly some of the older versions thereof have limitations. So we've talked about engagement software. The other is there are a lot of team management platforms out there which are really useful in that they do make a more structured environment. They make it easier to check in. There's a lot of utility there, but because they're often predicated on the previous understanding of organizations, which is that messaging happens only from the top and it only comes down and it only comes through a particular channel in each time, it means that you've got the same problems of that game of telephone, just more widespread. So again, not saying that these things are evils necessarily, but they in many cases have come out from a different understanding of how influence can happen within the organization. There's a lot of reasons why, and again, this is just due diligence here. A lot of reasons why I think companies are starting to explore some of these new solutions, largely related around the need to be more agile, to be able to move more quickly. As we've seen in the last couple of years, being agile has been an extremely important competitive advantage. There's also an issue of consistency. One of the things that we've seen, particularly in the last year or two, is that if messaging within an organization is not consistent, then you're losing trust, not just with your employees, but also with external stakeholders. And that trust has, again, extreme value. And then of course the cost or the lack of control. As you've got more of an autonomous workforce, the risk of those bad behaviors goes up because every one of your individual employees is now literally representing your organization. And again, cost is underwriting all of these things. So I wanted to move now a little bit towards what the kind of conversations that we typically have with leaders that I think are really useful. And again, hopefully this will lend itself into the conversation that we're about to have. So one of the big things that I like to highlight is that the important conversation that needs to have is around connecting the individual and the organization. It's not necessarily that you need values A, B, and C. So one of the things that I encourage leaders to think about is how do individuals' identities match up with the organization's identity? And again, I recognize that this sounds, perhaps painfully bespoke, but from an employee perspective, it's very much the way that they're looking at it, right? Like, how do my core values match this organization's identity? And if you keep in mind that, particularly knowledge workers are now competing on a truly global marketplace, this becomes a very serious differentiator. Similarly, from a leadership perspective, how do individuals' behaviors impact the organization? And again, as a whole, and again, what underwrites this is the idea that you can actually gather that data and look at it at scale, which is relatively new, because it used to be that you'd look at what the ROI for an individual department was, and if it wasn't up to snuff, then you'd have to do something about it in aggregate. That's not the case anymore in the same way, in that now you can drill down and really understand where that alignment is or is not having an impact. And then lastly, what can you do to improve that behavior? Where does it actually matter, and where is it impacting the individual as well as the organization? So again, it's really around breaking down the silos around that purpose for the organization and creating interactions between the individual and the organization at scale that consistently build towards something stronger or something bigger. And lest that be too fluffy, I would summarize it by saying that it's not about choosing the right values, it's not courage, honesty, and collaboration. It's really about getting some values up that seem reasonably resonant and then having an ongoing conversation. It turns out that culture is a process, not an achievement that you get to and then you're done. It's something that happens in an ongoing way, and it's the act of participating in that iteration, in that growth, that creates the alignment itself. It's a collective act. Back to the old cyberpunk, I think it was Gibson that said reality is a consensual hallucination. No, it wasn't Gibson, but it's still a good quote. Anyway, so the kind of conversations that I would encourage leaders to have would be to look at what they stand for and then how that aligns with their market. And the reason I bring this up is that often we talk to leaders who say, yeah, we know what our purpose is, there it is on the wall. And when you start breaking it down, that may or may not align with what the market is currently demanding of them. So Michael, back to your question earlier around how often companies had a sense of their purpose. I think that even if they have a sense of it, it's worth reconsidering or doing a little bit of an analysis around whether or not those those values or that core purpose is leading them in the right direction. And again, this ties into the concept that culture is a collective act. If you expect it to change, then it's not a bad thing that you may be off the mark. It just means that then you have an opportunity to improve it. The second big thing that I would point to is that it's worth using a variety of different data sources to try and nurture this change at scale. And part of the reason for that is obviously self-serving, and I have a platform in that area. So do the rest of us. But the idea being that there's a lot more to work with than used to exist, and it's worthwhile to understand how to use those tools, because it really can be make or break for your organization. And then lastly, the really big challenge, this saving the best for last, the hardest thing that I see companies struggle with is the idea that this is not something you're going to be done with this quarter or this year. This is an ongoing and continuous task. It's part of managing your company just as much as maintaining your finances is, which is part of the reason I go with the byline of P&L of culture, because you need to be conducting that cultural growth continuously if you're going to be successful. So, Gabriella, do we want to jump to this next poll?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, following this conversation, I'm curious to hear from the audience the degree to which their leadership team actively can quantify cultural health on an ongoing basis. So if we pull up this poll, we're looking to just better understand what I think is a really important detail of this question is the degree to which you're quantifying cultural health throughout your organization and in real time or in an ongoing way. So let's leave this up for a couple moments and see what we get.
And the stress here is leadership team, not just your group. Fascinating mix. I feel bad for the folks for whom this is not relevant or not a priority.
Do you feel bad for the ones for whom just said no?
No, because that's why they're here, presumably.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to understand, we knew this when we wrote the poll, what the difference was between, what does regularly mean to some of us? Is that the ability to quantify this, not to continue to harp on the engagement survey, but to continue to harp on the engagement survey? Are you defining metrics like that as a mechanism to quantify cultural health would be my first question. And then my second question is, how are we actually defining regularly? So if we close out this poll and in the interest of time, quickly hop to the second, I think that guides us towards sort of what I've just laid out here in terms of the next area to explore, which is how does your organization currently monitor and measure its evolving culture today? So Josh, as we can kick off this poll as I talk here, Josh has outlined the fact that culture is a process, right? It is evolving now more than ever. Your culture is disrupted when you make the most recent announcement about people coming back into the office. It's disrupted once again when you've made the election to go into a hybrid setting. And so a handful of different variables on a daily basis impacting this evolving culture. So I'm curious from the group, as we've laid that out here, what are the mechanisms that you're employing to monitor and measure this today?
Any bets on how many of them don't monitor or measure?
I don't have that kind of courage, but we'll see how many people double down on the engagement surveys I peed on earlier in the conversation.
My guess is that it's going to be a little bit of everything, and I'll tell you why. I think that our organizations have done a tremendous job at, biting on the cell, right? There's different ways that different solutions have come to the table and said, hey, culture really matters. Here's a way to improve it, right? If it starts with measurement. But my guess is that.
Wow.
Mocking you,
Wow.
Gabriella.
All right, we'll take it. I did not expect we don't monitor or measure. That as the second highest is certainly an interesting one. Though what I would say, actually, I'll do this, Josh, sort of as the expert in this culture space today. Do you think at times is there ever a case in which it's better not to monitor or measure versus employ the wrong types of measurement practices? In other words, is we don't monitor or measure actually the worst answer here?
I mean, when you're just about to retire and really need the company to show good numbers, it's a great time not to measure.
Interesting. And the only good time is what you're saying.
Yeah. Otherwise, I mean, yes, you can get bad data, but the bad data is just gonna, it will tell you that people are generally disgruntled, or, I mean, at least it's some data. And then you can go in and figure out that it's bad data and how and why, etc. But no data, I mean, that's just flying blind.
And what are the risks of flying blind? And that's of course a loaded question here, but I'd love for you to elaborate on that as we transition to the discussion topics on the next slide.
I would just like to make a quick comment on that, which is we don't have the survey, but I am actually surprised by the number of organizations, a third of the people saying that they literally don't measure. And a little bit of everything is sort of indicative to me of, we know just enough. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. I am not surprised at all that almost half of them use engagement surveys, because I think what we've identified here is, I'll use the P word, a pathology. Organizations are using engagement as a proxy for culture and cultural involvement and alignment. And I think, as Josh has articulated, and I think the work that his company has done demonstrates, as does Gabriella's company, is that engagement does not inherently mean alignment. Engagement does not necessarily mean agreement. That may be an inference too far on this. And so I consider this to be an alarm bell, and I'll be very, very curious as to the questions and comments coming in chat, because based on the people who've chosen to participate this, there's an immaturity and lack of readiness for a commitment to culture as a resource and an asset that we've heard described and outlined today. So I'm officially nervous as a result of this. And I have no dog in the fight.
Right. On the other hand, a significant number of companies are actually using engagement surveys, right? That if it was almost solely we don't measure or monitor, I think that would be worse, because at least there's an indication of some interest.
Well, let me double down on my argument. Aren't you surprised, Josh, he says, leading the witness, that the team management number was so low and the activity monitors? I don't think that's a smile of amusement and laughter, Josh. I mean, you're way more intimately involved on these things. I'm surprised. I'm surprised.
Yes, my guess is that I think team management software is less well understood, or is often blended in with, various office suites and office tools and whatnot. I'm not sure that everyone understands exactly what that covers. And similarly with activity monitoring, I don't think that that's as well as understood or clearly branded as engagement surveys. But yes, it is a surprising number, in terms of the responses we got. But I think, as you pointed out, it's symptomatic of the pathology that we're diagnosing in general, which is that there isn't enough data or understanding of its importance.
I absolutely. So let's open this up. And Gabriella, I'm sure you have comments on this. The idea that basically, it's like it's like using a thermometer to talk about overall general health. I consider an engagement survey to be the technical instrumental equivalent of sticking a thermometer in one orifice or the other in regards to cultural health. I think it's very, it shouldn't be quote unquote ignored, but the idea that it really informs anything other than the most trivial of symptoms strikes me as disconcerting. And by the way, I just want to pay the attendees the compliment of they're here for a reason. The people who come to MIT webinars, you're here because you're smart, not because you're not smart. So the fact that your organizations are not taking the measurement of culture seriously ought to be of concern.
Yeah, and I would say, I wouldn't go so far, Michael, to say that they're not taking it seriously, right? Because these engagement surveys, we know, lead to disruption, and they lead to analysis and time, and many organizations then using focus groups, action plans, follow-ups, pulse surveys. That's careful attention and costs associated with using the engagement survey. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that your leadership team isn't taking the measurement of this seriously. I hope that what we will go so far as to say is that because you're taking it seriously, allow us to talk about other ways to measure this, because if you're going to take it seriously, let's measure it better. And so I think that piece is what I would emphasize.
Yeah, I would say that, but I'm going to be I'm going to be the drooling attack dog or foaming at the mouth attack dog on this. If I go to a doctor and he or she continually just takes my temperature and my blood pressure, but I'm not well and I'm never offered an MRI or an X-ray or blood tests, I'm really not impressed with the healthcare operation there.
Sure.
And I think everybody listening to this takes and participating here takes culture seriously. If you use a fundamentally unserious metric to assess culture, how authentic can you be as a leader saying, oh, culture is one of our most important assets. The reason why you should come work here or stay here is because our culture values and empowers you. Forgive me, show me the data. Show me the data.
Sure. Let's shift the conversation. I know we have highlighted 3 key themes here on things that we think that everyone should be talking about. Exploring alternate data sources, which I think we're absolutely touching upon right now. Data sensitivity, so we know that this is where this conversation goes next, right? If we explore other data sources, what is then associated with the data sensitivity? How do we take that into account? How does that impact culture by itself? And then leading us to our third theme, this topic of culture and productivity, what is the impact of really focusing our efforts on culture? What does it mean for our business performance? So, well, we have a handful of questions here. I'd love to actually entertain the audiences for a little bit here as well. So, Julia, if you want to share with us some of the questions that we can field, I think that we can kind of conclude out in hearing from the audience.
Great. Well, thank you all. We have some fascinating questions coming in after such a great presentation. I'm just going to dive right in. The first question is from Dylan. You made an interesting point about statistically modeling and managing values, beliefs, and behaviors, he says. What are some ways to do this?
Who wants to call Josh?
Josh, that's all yours.
All right. Yeah, so I'll try and be gracious about it. Like, there are a lot of different ways out there to do it. Everything from just measuring, like you can measure email communications, you can, do subjective surveys. Like, there's a lot of stuff out there. So I want to be clear that I'm close to one solution that I've worked on, but there are many out there. You need to choose one that's right for you. One of the solution that I helped develop uses peer-to-peer surveys so that you get strongly contextual information. Those surveys are very short. They're about 3 minutes. They're run weekly, so it's longitudinal. You get data over time, and we have a very strong set of bias models that we use to try and correct for that. But again, back to the core points. Really, the value that we're looking for is to arm the employees with information about themselves and their own behaviors, so they can drive their own careers. And as a second-order effect, filter that up so that leaders can help create a correlation between that and the goals of the organization.
I just want to say that Josh isn't giving himself and his company and his organization enough credit, because first and foremost, they're not just doing a survey, they're building a model. And just to give you an example, we were discussing this in the pre-call, even the questions that people skip answering, it reveals a bias, because why are so many people skipping this question? So we're building a model, we're building a baseline, and that's key. It's not just, again, taking a temperature every 4 or 5 weeks. That's not a model, that's temperature taking. That's not a model of what makes you hot, what makes you cold.
It's a good point, Michael. I mean, one of the things that I often have a hard time engaging is it's difficult to get across how much standard data processes can be used in something like this. So for example, yes, we monitor whether people skip questions because it infers that they don't understand it or they don't agree with it or it makes them uncomfortable. It points to a problem. But we also measure how long it takes for them to answer a question, whether their mouse is hovering over one answer and then it suddenly changes, etc. And then conversely, when they get done doing that survey, which takes about 3 minutes, then we give them different information every single time, depending on their role in the organization, how long it took them to fill out the survey, where they stand relative to their peers on that particular value. All of that is extremely customized from a data perspective. It's not you either get A or you get B. It's something that's designed specifically for an individual, which I think is critical.
So you're doing active tracking of the surveys, pun intended.
And this may get to the data privacy issue. It's done in service of the individual. One of the things that we've found is that employees are happy to share all their data, or at least what we found is that individuals are happy to share copious amounts of data, whatever it is that they're doing, all the information about the surveys that they're answering, etc., if that results in direct, tangible value to them. So
I mean, that's the big piece here for this discussion for me, Josh, where I feel like, well, both you and I come at solving this problem that we've surfaced here today from very different angles, right? You're looking at peer-to-peer surveys. I'm looking at productivity monitoring and activity insights. But what we're doing is we're both following a key principle that hopefully we've really highlighted, which is that longitudinal data, that ongoing data that doesn't just look at sentiment, but looks at behavior. How are the values and how is that driving you to behave? And I think that that's the piece, even from the hovering over a survey, right? I thought about it. I kind of want to answer this. I want to answer it, but I went this way because I know that this is the right answer, right? And so I think this piece around behavior and being able to give insights and feedback to the employee on behavior is something that we just so tightly align on despite these different data sets, right? It gets back to this topic that you and I, Michael, have talked about a lot, which is this works when you empower your employee. This doesn't work if you don't
better
empower.
when you empower your employee. This is one of the themes of the webinars. Are we empowering managers and leaders at the expense of employees? Are we empowering employees? You know, how do you strike a new balance? And this goes right back to your opening remarks, Josh, about this is a different workforce. The principles are different here.
Let me jump in here with another question very quickly, because I think it's an important one here. And I'll ask each of you for a very brief, maybe a tweet size answer to this. But Rudy asks, what exactly does the word culture mean to the panel?
I'm going to give the immediate answer from Gabriella's former employer, McKinsey. Marvin Bauer, one of the great men of management consulting, says, culture is the way we do things around here. That's my operational definition of culture. And my view is, to make it a second tweet, is we need better data about the way we do things around here. And that's why we wanted to do this webinar.
Gabriella, Josh, would you agree with that definition, or do you have something different?
Well, Michael has snagged for my own schooling, so I certainly agree with it. I think if I were to elaborate on it, I would say that, you know, as Michael talks about, we need new data, or we need better data to understand that. That is a function of a pain point that we've all felt in the last 2 years, which is when we can't see the way we do things around here, it becomes extremely hard to manage. And so we need to be able to see via, whether that be ongoing peer-to-peer surveys, productivity monitoring. It's not really a whether, right? It's a combination of these powerful data sets that are before us, and we need to then go forth and advance culture, see the culture for what it is and advance it. Not a tweet, but certainly my response.
You have a tweet one for us, Josh?
I would add, it's not how we talk about what we do, it's what we do.
Okay, so how things get done around here. Jennifer asks, should data be shared with the group that is surveyed only, or should it go up the leadership chain?
Gabriella, you want to take a first shot?
I'll take that
people take the data sensitivity question seriously, Gabriella.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. I'll go back to one of the things Josh said, which is there is no right set of values for your organization. Every organization's different. And different organizations will view sort of data privacy in different ways. And that's going to be a function of the way data has been held in the past at your organization and maybe where people are coming from. But what I would say is that if we want to make the most out of data, we need to be able to use it, and we need to be able to give our decision makers the insight that they need so that they can provide the support to their organization to be both healthy and productive. Now, I always advocate for putting that data directly in the hands of the employee, right? And so it starts with giving it to the employee. And then I think that there are levels of anonymized aggregation that can happen and be rolled up to the top so that those same leaders can view that data in an anonymized way and make decisions to provide support around things like burnout, retention issues, turnover, not after they happen, but before they happen.
Yeah.
We have another question here from Marilyn. To what degree might your metrics serve as a more valuable early warning system for leaders who bully? I have seen a number of organizational leaders who don't address bullying until far too late.
Yes, I'll jump in on that one. We early on when we were developing our platform, we had a situation where we were brought into a company that was looking to promote someone from a middle management layer into the senior executive team. and they were broadly throughout the entire organization lauded as being an ideal candidate. They had the skills, everyone would believe that they understood what was required. The gentleman in question was widely appreciated and considered a subject matter expert. They thought this guy is the guy for the role. Then they suddenly discovered that out of all of the surveys done about him, he scored top marks, except in collaboration, in which he scored lowly, only when judged by women. And so they did some interviews, and they turned out that there was misconduct, but that in an individual basis, those women weren't comfortable in violating the larger social conversation. So to answer your question, I think that it can be extraordinarily useful. That we know that social dynamics enable bullying when it's in place and support it, as in perpetuating it if that's part of the approved social contract. By taking data out, you can anonymize that. You can look at it in aggregate. You can do a bunch of things in order to reveal problems that might not otherwise be exposed.
Yeah, I would offer another way to go about that as well, right? So Josh is collecting it via feedback. When we use productivity and activity monitoring, one of the things that we oftentimes see our customers do is to create new groups within our solution. One that immediately comes to mind is a customer that has done this for individuals under new managers, right? So if you had a set of individuals that all of a sudden are under a new manager, and you've watched their activity drastically decline, their productivity activity, their engagement activity, maybe they're signing online a little bit later and later in the morning because they're just feeling disconnected. And so you're watching their work habits really begin to look different. And that behavior changed when you swapped their manager. Now, this certainly doesn't give you the degree of feedback that Josh speaks to in his solution, because then he's really getting to the heart, perhaps, of that bullying piece for that specific group of people. But what it does to this question is it flags the indicator before that problem becomes any more pervasive. And it guides you in having a discussion that says, with each of those team members, perhaps it's the HR business partner, perhaps it's a skip level manager that says, hey, I want to meet with your team and just understand how things are going. You have a new manager. Are you feeling engaged? Do you feel aligned to your work? Do you understand the strategy? And so by monitoring that sort of productivity activity, you get that insight immediately as soon as you see that behavior change. And that's where you start having the conversation before the issue becomes more pervasive than it already is.
Really interesting comment here from an audience member. Of course, we measure what we think is important, but not measuring culture doesn't mean we aren't paying attention to it. What matters is behavior. Leadership is about making an example rather than just measuring. What is your opinion on this point?
I am a huge fan and have done research on what it means to quote unquote lead by example. Then again, with all due respect to the person making that comment, do we know how well people lead by example? Does this person's direct reports, could they give examples of how this person is led by example? How scalable is this? How transparent? So I actually am of the view, and I'm going to be a hard ass on it, I am of the view that we can talk qualitatively about lead by example, but I want to be able to measure it in some sort of meaningful way. I think you're avoiding knowledge, you're avoiding insight if you cheat yourself and say, well, it's not measurable, so we're not going to measure it. I think one of the profound aspects of digital media, digital platforms, is that our ability to instrument interactions and behavior is such that we should make an effort to gain greater insight into what it means to lead by example. That's my argument. I'm perfectly happy with people disagreeing, but make the effort first. Make the effort first.
Okay, we have a small business question. If my small organization is one that doesn't currently measure culture, what is the first step we can take to implement a measurement system? And I would assume this could go to large organizations as well, but let's start with small business.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you might assume that from Josh or me, the first reaction would be to sort of pick your solution, but that's not the first step, right? The first step is to really start devising a strategy and a set of principles around where your culture is today, how you believe it's what is informing it, what is influencing it, and how are your employees feeling. And then come up with a set of principles around, if you're going to measure this, how are you going to share the data? How are you going to use the data? And what actions are you willing to take? Because if you haven't had a strategic conversation with your leadership team and gotten a level of commitment that you will take action on this data, then that's where the conversation should stop. You really should only be moving towards picking your measurement solution after you've gotten commitment and you've aligned as a leadership team that you will both measure, share, and take action. So first step is that conversation.
Agreed. There's significant risk in rolling out a data aggregation or analytics position or platform without that buy-in, because it's really threatening. You know, one of the earliest critiques that we got was, we love your platform. It's like a light in a room that has always been dark, but oh God, the cockroaches. And sometimes those cockroaches can kill you. So you really, you need to be prepared for that before you start.
Better cockroaches than rats.
Okay, here's a good question too. Could you describe some cultural values that more provoke productivity than others? Or if you see culture as a process, which patterns lead to productivity?
I'm going to pop in and say the cultural value. I wrote a book on collaboration. I think a cultural value that promotes productivity is one, do you enable other people to perform better? You know, there's always somebody, and this is huge in sports analytics, in basketball and in baseball and in football and in soccer. You know, who are the people when they're on the court, on the field, everybody seems to play better. Okay, so it's not just their performance, they elevate the team, they elevate the group. That's a key one for me.
Gabriella and Josh, we have just about another minute here. Can you add in?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm a product of recent conversations with Josh, where I've really come to understand the degree to which, I'm not going to give you a direct values answer. I'm going to tell you that the tighter those values are aligned, the more you're going to get to what Michael said, which is that iron sharpens iron. And if you can collect some sort of identity around values, whether that be open and honest and transparent, which are all things that, of course, we support in a culture, the tighter those are and the more people feel as if there's little dissonance in their environment, the more productive they're going to be, because you're avoiding the distractions and the frustration of, hey, we're saying one thing and we're doing another, right? So it's the tight alignment of the values that you subscribe to that really lead to that level of productivity. Josh, not to steal your thunder there, but I hope that's a product of listening to a lot of what you've said.
Well, back at you. One of the things that I wanted to build on with that was that you can have a particular value or a particular kind of behavior, but the way it's articulated within your organization is unique. And an example that comes to mind is we had a company that had a lot of call centers, and they had a senior leadership team that were really hard driving, straight out of business school, and they defined one of their core values as courage. And courage to them meant I stick my neck out, I take risks to benefit the organization, I'm the first one to raise my hand when I see something that's gone wrong. And they ran that with their organization, and 95% of the organization basically said, no one I know evinces that. And the reason was 95% of the organization were people who were working in call centers as like a second job, and they could not afford to take risks with their revenue streams. So for them, courage meant something totally different. It meant I keep my head down when things are on fire and do my job. It was much more of a stoic example. So the reason I bring that up is it's not about the particular value, it's about how that aligns with what your company needs.
Well, we are out of time here, and I want to thank you all for a fascinating conversation, and to our audience for just great questions. I only wish we could get to them all. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our sponsor, ActiveTrack, for this. So ActiveTrack, thank you, and Josh, Michael, Gabriella, thank you.
And thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for your audience too. Cheers.